Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. I got another Master Duel video for you. So it's definitely been a minute since we've done a tier list, and I've been meaning to do this a little bit sooner, but you know what? I think the end of the season is a pretty good time to do it. So I figured going into season 23, I think is what we're about to, yeah, 23, yep. Going into season 23, I figured I'd break down, I've got 40 different decks here, 40 different archetypes. To break them down between tiers 1, 2, 3, and Rogue, and see where all of the top 40 decks of the meta end up shaking out. Now, a couple of disclaimers, two disclaimers that I want to throw out here before we really get into the meat of this. The first is that I'm currently recording this the night before the pack with like Yata-Garasu and stuff comes out. I don't, and also like, what is it, the Prisoner Flame Princess? So I'm kind of taking a small chance recording this when I am. It just works out best for my personal schedule. But don't think / am hoping there's not going to be anything super duper impactful in that set to shake up the meta. But on the off chance there is, I don't know, I might end up re-recording this, but I'm just throwing out this disclaimer just to know that this is before we know the contents of that pack, or at least before I do anyway. So the other thing that I kind of like to say before every tier list video is that this is my personal take of where the meta is at. It's okay if you don't agree, and it's okay also if you don't agree in the comments. I just ask that you don't be mean-spirited about it, because that's not fun for anybody. Discourse is fun, being rude is not. Also, if I put a deck in Rogue, some people equate me to putting a deck in Rogue as saying that it's bad. Could not be further from the truth. Literally, every single deck you're seeing here is capable of hitting Master and Master 1 with a determined / skilled enough pilot. These are all literally good decks. These are literally, every one of these decks is good. None of these decks are bad. I just want to establish that before we get into this. So, I'm going to start right at the top here, as represented by Alibur, Branded Desia. Branded Desia is a deck that I think has long held its position in the tier 2 slot, and I would say that it is still in that tier 2 slot, but it is noticeably slipping down a little bit further as time goes on. In the past, I've touted Branded Desia as like being one of the upper tier 2 decks, but the power creep is very noticeably starting to affect it. However, I will say this, they do still have some more support coming out, and once they get that, I imagine they'll still be around tier 2, but they'll definitely get a noticeable boost in power. So we're really waiting for that for Branded Desia. But the thing about Branded Desia too is that it's in the top cut of pretty much every single tournament ever. This is something I often point out in videos where we talk about tournament results, because people who are skilled with Branded Desia tend to often pilot the deck very, very well and very, very consistently to good results. So I feel like it's kind of like the epitome in a lot of ways of what a tier 2 deck is. So, all right, Punk is going to be the next deck that we talk about here. So Punk's main iteration in this meta is as Kashtira Punk, right? So in that regard, I think that's kind of how I'm going to be evaluating the deck here. Of course, a more pure or a Chaos Punk is still very much a thing, but often I do say that I do want to say, though, that I think it's better to cut down on the Kashtira engine more so than I had my initial deck profile, but I'll cover that whenever I cover Punk eventually. I think Punk is probably a lower tier 3 deck. As I put more decks in each tier, I'll also put them in the order that I think they go on in the respective tier. Punk, I do think, kind of teeters on the edge of Rogue, but I would call this a lower tier 3 deck. Kashtira did noticeably boost its power level, but that said, it is still not able to quite break into that same barrier into tier 2 that's like something like Branded is at, right? Alright, so Marinis is going to be the next deck we talk about. This is definitely, I think, the definition of a Rogue deck, where, again, a dedicated Marinis pilot, somebody who's been playing the deck like for as long as it's been viable, or even longer even than that, would definitely be able to take it to Master 1, and even somebody who's just like picking up the deck, if you play a lot and you play with it well, then I think you could take it to Master as well. It's a pretty decent Towers Turbo deck, but I've said this before about Marinis. I think if you want a Cyber deck that's also like a Towers Turbo archetype, there are like plenty of options, and I don't know, like Marinis does have its own little quirks, like the trap cards in particular. as well as the fact that the Aqua Argonaut tends to be so big it has a lot of attack points. But to me, it doesn't super stand out from the other Cyber's Towers decks, and the other Cyber's kind of Towers decks, I'm mostly thinking of Adagnister, right? They do have some more, like, I don't know, I don't want to accuse Marinis of being a one-trick deck, but at least from the times that I've played against it, it kind of seems to be like Aquanaut Argid or bust, right? But again, that could just be my inexperience with the deck. So if I'm wrong, again, feel free to tell me so in the comments. Just, don't be weird about it. But, yeah, I don't know. Marinis, very solid rogue deck all the same. All right, Kashtira. Oof, this is one that I'm really eager to get into. And this is the archetype that's really kind of made me put off making this video the longest. And you're probably wondering, where exactly am I going to put Kashtira? As much as I kind of want to put it in tier 2, I do still think that Kashtira is probably a tier 1 deck, but unlike the top of tier 1, where I think, towards the beginning of the month, a lot of people assumed this deck would be, I think it's going to go more towards the bottom. I've mentioned this in other videos in the past, but I tweeted like a week and a half before this card came out. I tweeted that I didn't think Kashtira was going to be that bad. I thought people were overhyping it. And oh my goodness, people on Twitter just gave me so much shit for it. But now I get to do my little "I told you so" song and dance. Yeah, with Prosperity and the Field Spell both at 1, it's just like the consistency is so hampered. I will say this much: I do think Fenrir does need to go to 0 or 1. I think personally I would prefer 0, but we'll see. Because not even because of Kashtira, but just because it's so generically good as like a staple card, right? I think 1 would be fine, but I wouldn't mind seeing 0. But I don't think that Kashtira may not even need many more hits beyond that, honestly. So, like, a lot of people decry Arise Heart specifically, but like, the thing is, Arise Heart, while it can be a bit of a pain because it banishes cards, the other thing about it, and this is kind of the other point that I made too, like, it is so readily proc stuff like Imperm and Triple Tack, especially Triple Tack, both Talent and Thrust, like, and people, oh my god, this is the other thing too, it's like, I mean, to be fair, we didn't know Thrust was coming out at the time, but the other thing that people were saying is like, oh, well, you can't, like, search the outs for it. And, like, 1, yeah, you can now. 2, like, there are so many ways to out the card between stuff like Imperm and Triple Tack that, like, you're reasonably enough likely to open it. Anyway, yeah, I think Kashtira is probably tier 1. I don't think the deck is, like, solved yet, but I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if we see it slip down into tier 2. I might even get some comments being like, no way, this deck is so weak, I think it's like upper tier 2. I imagine a lot of these would be a lot of the same people who told me that I was wrong to say it's not the best tier 1 deck, but anyway, no, I'm going to put this at the bottom of tier 1. I think that's a fine spot for Kashtira at the moment. Astrograph Magician is going to represent Pen Magicians, so this also a rogue deck. I'm going to put this a little bit above Marinis, so I think they're like vaguely comparable. In terms of power, like in terms of variety, Pen Magician obviously able to do a bunch of stuff. I will say whenever we get, Exceed the Pendulum, the Link 3, the like even more beyond the Pendulum, whatever they end up calling it, that will definitely be a nice boost to, I imagine this deck as well as Pendulum decks all around, but for the time being, I think Pendulum is, like, Pendulum Magician in particular, it's a pretty good rogue deck, I would say that this is one of those Master Duel decks that's felt like it's been in the same power level in, like, meta position that it's always been in, and this is one that you'll see winning tournaments from time to time, even in today's meta, because, again, these people who have been playing Pendulum Magician since the game's release are, like, still using it to great success nowadays, and are often, again, these rogue decks, or not even necessarily rogue decks, but there are just certain archetypes that for whatever reason, it seems like people who are really on that archetype are like super on top of it, and can really take that deck to heights that the average player couldn't. That's true of Brand Desia, I think, and it's also very true of Pendulum Magician, so. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about Plunder Patrol. Runic Plunder Patrol is definitely a more viable deck than some people may realize. It's one that I've probably should have been including on this tier list for quite a bit, I think. It's just not a deck I see super often, but you know, it is still a solid enough deck, and it's actually seeing, from what I've noticed on Master Duel meta, because usually before I set up these tier lists, I'll like go through the top decks on Master Duel meta and just kind of like make sure I'm getting everything right. It seems to be that like there's been a little bit of an increase in Plunder Patrol play recently. I think this is a pretty solid rogue deck all around. You know, it's mostly, I think most of what's holding it back isn't even necessarily like the fact that it is a bad deck, because I don't think Plunder Patrol is a bad deck at all. It's that like there's just so much else that's more powerful, and it might seem kind of weird. It's like, well, isn't that the same thing as saying it's a bad deck? And I don't think so, right? I think that, you know, there is in fact a difference between saying, you know, a deck is maybe fair versus unfair, right? That's game terminology that people often use, is like fair versus unfair. You know, is a deck particularly like I don't know. It's really easier. It's really more easy to quantify in something like Magic the Gathering, right? Where you can observe power creep, like as far as like what a card's stats or ability for its mana cost are, a little bit more clearly. With Yu-Gi-Oh, the power creep in that regard tends to be a bit more nuanced, but I think the same, you know, philosophy applies here, right? Plunder Patrol is, I would call that a fair archetype, right? It doesn't do anything absurd, even when it goes off, and it, you know, unlike a lot of other decks, it does need a little bit more of a, like, dedicated package slash openings or whatever to, maybe not necessarily openings, right? Like, it's not like it, you know, it's like it probably doesn't have its, like, 2, maybe even 1 card combos, but as far as, like, how consistently you can play them through and what they actually result in compared to other decks, you know, I think you get the gist of what I'm talking about. Anyway, the next archetype I think I want to cover here is going to be the Blackwing deck. So, Blackwings are another pretty eternal, like, rogue archetype. I don't know, it's like, they're a deck, I kind of want to put them a little bit lower than usual just because I haven't been seeing them around lately, but that doesn't mean they're any worse as a deck. And this is another thing that, like, especially affects the rogue tier, I think a lot more than any of the others, is that sometimes a deck just doesn't get played enough to be represented and have its fair share at the meta, you know, representation in that regard, right? Like, even though I haven't seen people on Blackwings, that doesn't mean that Blackwings is always bad. It might just mean that nobody's playing Blackwings. And again, it's really easy to equate the two. Nobody's playing this deck equals this deck is bad. But that is far from the truth. You know, a lot of the times these sleeper decks aren't even like somebody, like sometimes someone will pilot a rogue deck to great success, and it's because they're just like that skilled with the deck. But sometimes, like, you'll just stumble across a deck and you'll legitimately be like, why aren't more people playing this? It's really good. And those are kind of the sleeper decks that tend to not be, like, one-offs or one person repeatedly topping with that one deck, but then kind of steamroll into that deck having a wider meta presence. So I'm not saying that's true of Blackwing. I'm just saying that I think Blackwing is one of those decks that you might not see, in my case, like the entire season, but that doesn't mean it's suddenly completely unplayable and you shouldn't play it whatsoever. I think it's still a fine rogue deck. Same can be said of Galaxy-Eyes. Galaxy-Eyes, I'm actually surprised I don't see more of, given the recent support. I mean, of course, obviously, you know, it's going to be overshadowed by a lot of other newer decks like Kashtira, like Purrely, etc., etc. But, you know, their continuous spell card that lets you steal from the extra deck is definitely noteworthy. Of course, also is the deck's ability to pump out these huge monsters that can just wreck your opponent as far as like damage goes, just by their like sheer attack points. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, every time I play against it and they drop the continuous spell, it's pretty annoying. So I'd put it again about the same level as these other decks: Pen Magician, Marinis, Blackwing, so on and so forth. Sword Soul Tenyi. Sword Soul Tenyi is what I would also call a tier 2 deck in this meta. I don't know, I think I might actually put it a little bit lower than Brain and Desia. In the past, I've often ranked these two decks closer together, but I tend to rank Sword Soul a little bit higher. But the thing is, I talked about power creep getting to Desia a little bit. The power creep is definitely more noticeable in Sword Soul, mostly because Sword Soul has still not received like another full wave of support, and looking at the TCG and OCG and like not only that, but the overall, lore of the deck too, it's definitely not looking like we're going to get that other wave in any time soon. So, that being the case, though, I don't think Sword Soul, is bad for that reason. Like, obviously, I have it here in Tier 2. Like, obviously, I think the deck is, more than just fine. I think it's even good. But I do think it will start to more noticeably slip. I feel like I've made this statement a couple of times now. And to be fair, the deck is kind of slipping just slowly and steadily within the same tier. But we do get closer and closer to the day it goes down to Tier 3. But it's like, oh no, this deck is like Tier 3. I think that's still fine, of course. Like, a Tier 3 deck, I think, far more so than a Rogue deck is like very, very capable of hitting Master 1. But it's not even just like somebody who's played the deck for months and months on end, but somebody who just takes the time to learn it for a little while and then dedicates like maybe a season or two to playing it could get it to Master 1. So yeah, Sword Soul, if you still want to buy into it, like I do still think, as Foxy and I said in my recent Sword Soul video, I do still think that this is a good starting off point to get into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Sword Soul is very easy to grasp as a combo deck, or just in its combo lines rather, and it's got not only that low enough floor that it's a good entry point for people who are new to the competitive scene, but it's also got a high skill ceiling, and it will very much reward you for playing it more and more and more and learning the deck better. So, highly recommend it for that reason. Alright, let's talk about Mathmech. Let's talk about Mathmech. So, I mean, it's no surprise that I love Mathmech. And it's not just that I love Mathmech. There's been a noticeable increase lately in people playing Mathmech, even before the recent leaks of the new Firewall cards and just like Cybers cards in general that showed up on Master Duel meta recently. So, I think that Mathmech is already very well poised in this meta. Now, there are a lot of people who might say, oh, but Arise Heart's banishing all your stuff and has Shifter sometimes, and oh, there's still Despia and Dragon Link running around with Bestials, so yeah, and people have Call By, like, doesn't Mathmech have a really hard time? And it's like, yeah, those are factors against Mathmech, but like, literally any deck has like some amount of factors in the meta going against it, or at least in a particularly diverse or varied meta, which I do think we are in at this point in time. That is actually one thing I wanted to touch on that I didn't really when I was talking about Kashtira and just Tier 1 decks in general. There are some metas where the gap between Tier 1 and Tier 2 is vast, right? When Tearlaments was Tier 1, Tier 0 meta is a great example of that. The difference between Tearlament and pretty much every other deck in Tier 2, or every deck in Tier 2 rather, was very, very, very much more vast than we've seen in a lot of metas. In this particular meta, like, I'm going to call Kashtira the bottom of Tier 1, which I think is a fair place for it. Kashtira does not feel that much better than the Tier 2 decks. It feels like very barely better. And I think that's why I said earlier that I think some people might even say, like, what are you talking about? Kashtira is Tier 2. I think because that line is so blurred in this meta. And there are a lot of people who don't like metas like this because there are so many decks that are up for that spot. And it's so unclear that you have to prepare for a wide variety of decks. But I'm the kind of player who likes to play a wide variety of decks, so while there is definitely skill when most people are on the same deck, because, the mirror match is typically going to come down to who can play the deck better, and you can also prepare better, so it makes teching and deck building in that regard more skillful. But at the same time, I just like varied metas, and we are very much in a highly varied meta at the moment, in my opinion. So anyway, going back to Mathmech, I think Mathmech is a Tier 2 deck. Maybe this is a bit bold of me, but I think it is currently even better than Branded Despia. And even if you don't think that is the case right now, the thing about Mathmech, as I touched on earlier, is these recent leaks have shown that we will be getting the new Firewall cards in the future, which will absolutely boost Mathmech. The thing is, too, and this is like one of the reasons I kind of hesitated to make this video tonight, as opposed to after knowing what's in the new selection pack coming out tomorrow, is that I think there is, alongside Yatagarasu, as far as spirit cards go, there's also Sakitama, which is a level 4 spirit monster that can essentially normal summon itself for free as an additional normal summon from your hand. That'll boost the power of literally any deck that plays a rank 4, because it's a free level 4 extender that doesn't even special summon, so it doesn't give your opponent a draw off max C. And, you know, that can potentially be used to help boost the power of Mathmech as well. In any case, I think Mathmech, again, currently right now, is very slightly more powerful than something like Branded Despia. I think you could easily make an argument for replacing him like this, or even this, but I'm also just a huge Mathmech fan. I think with Terahertz especially, a lot of people really underrate that card, because whenever I like put out, you know, Mathmech content featuring Terahertz, I'll have some people in the comments say that they think the old line with IP is better. I don't understand that personally, because like the old line with IP made like a 2 material Appaloosa alongside your Super Factorial, and I definitely think Terahertz is better than that. But in any case, so Mathmech. I think Mathmech is a very solid tier 2 deck right now. Don't sleep on it. Not only is it really good right now, it's going to get way better both in the near future and also in the not so distant future. So Thunder Dragon. Thunder Dragon I am going to put right alongside stuff like Pendulum and Galaxy-Eyes and all these other rogue decks. I think because, again, even within each tier, there are certain rogue decks that are better, or there are certain decks that are better than others. We'll cover, you know, some other rogue decks that are potentially better than what we're seeing here in a little bit. But, yeah, Thunder Dragon is, again, much like Pendulum Magician, one of those decks where I think it's been at about the same power level the whole time it's been in Master Duel. Very good now, and, well, not very good. It's like, you know, it's not tiered or anything, quote-unquote. But as I've said in the beginning of the video, all these rogue decks very much still capable of doing very well for themselves. Let me take a sip of water here. I've been talking for over 20 minutes at this point. Ooh. Okay. Dinosaurs. Dinosaurs is going to be our next deck. Another rogue deck. This one I'll put, like, it's a little bit lower than stuff like Pendulum Magician. I don't know, it's actually, like, I think pretty comparable, honestly. A lot of these rogue decks that I've never played, I don't really have much unique to say about them. But I guess the thing about Dinosaurs combo line is that it's kind of like, sometimes you have a lot of ways to search the Miscellaneousaurus, right? But it feels like if you don't have that, you're susceptible to so many different like types of disruption, but it's also not impossible to get it. I don't know, it seems like a cool deck. It takes a lot of URs though, like a lot of URs, like Fossil Digs, Overraptor, Miscellaneousaurus, as I mentioned, the big one that flips stuff face down, yeah. But anyway, Spyral, here's a rogue deck that I am going to put a little bit above the others, because here's the thing. Two-Tone showed us in the most recent MCS Season 2 Week 2 that dedicated Spyral pilots definitely show off just how ridiculous the deck overall is. It's wild to think that these kind of combo lines were like possible back in 2018, because this really does feel like a deck, quote-unquote, from the future in that regard. However, nowadays in 2023, the deck, while it can put out a very scary board, again, is just susceptible to a lot of different like kinds of disruption. It can be hard to know where the choke point is, though. I'm not going to pretend like I know, like, oh yes, you always Ash Blossom here, and that stops spirals every single time. But, another mistake that I think a lot of people make when they think about this deck is they think that it doesn't really have much going for it, like going second, but that's absolutely not true. The deck has a ton of gas, and I think some people think that, oh, in order to be good going second, you have to be playing, you know, hand traps and disruption, like a good amount of it, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you can just be playing all gas and like just push through whatever kind of like turn one board your opponent has made. So, and I do think Spyral counts as that sort of deck. Flunderies. I'm gonna put Flunderies at like the bottom of tier 3. It is not quite rogue, even though it kind of feels that way in terms of power level. But despite M-Pen being at 1 and Map being at 1, and of course all the other minor hits that the deck has received, the deck still actually manages to hang on and not really feel too different when you're playing against it. I mean, I don't play with Flunderies, so of course someone who plays with the deck notices these consistency hits a lot more than somebody like me who plays against it. But I will say that the deck definitely still performs fairly well, even with M-Pen being at 1, which is like so egregious. Come on, Konami. Like, as somebody who does not like playing against Flunderies, as somebody who does not enjoy this matchup, M-Pen can really come back to 3, and Map can come back to 2. But like, if that happened, I think Flu might maybe be tier 2, but would probably still just be upper tier 3, or like the top of tier 3 instead of the bottom of tier 3. But in any case, Flunderies is definitely still a fine deck overall. Endymion, I think Endymion is a little bit, I don't know, I just like, this is one of those decks I just don't see that often, so I kind of like struggled to compare it to the other Pendulum deck here, like Pendulum Magician. Like, I want to place it lower because I see it less often, but I also know that like some people don't play Endymion because they just don't like placing 20 spell counters on cards, and gotta be honest with you, I don't necessarily blame them for that. So let's see, I'm going to put Endymion in Rogue, of course. I'll put it like, I don't know, between Galaxy-Eyes and Marinis, sure. Maybe a little bit lower than Pen Magician, but ultimately still a comparable power level. Evil Eye, it's funny, Evil Eye is a rogue deck that I'm actually going to put it in upper rogue, because whenever Master Duel meta reports on like the usage and win rate updates within Master Duel itself, Evil Eye has like consistently had an over 50% win rate, which like, that's not an awful idea as far as like drawing the line between rogue and tier 3. Like, maybe tier 3, tiers 1 through 3 is every deck that consistently has an above 50% win rate. And then rogues are decks that are still good, but might overall have a slightly lower win rate than 50%. But I don't know. It feels weird to put Evil Eye in tier 3 just because you never see it. But one could argue that maybe the reason it has a high win rate is because of dedicated pilots, because it is, I will say, really difficult to use Disruption against Evil Eye in particular, because they have a lot of searches, and from what I've heard, I don't know much about the deck, but I've heard people say that the deck has a lot of searches, but like a lot of different ways to search, but they tend to want to search the same things no matter what they're using, so maybe that's why you can get such good win rate. Like, even if you like Ash or Imperm something, they can just use a different card to grab the same thing, but yeah, I'm going to leave it in upper rogue, just because it has that high of a win rate. I'll just leave it here. I think that's fine. Stun is stun is stun is stun is stun. I don't know. I'll just put it like in the middle of rogue. I think that's a decent enough spot for stun, right? It's about where it's always been. Not much to say about stun overall. Oh, Sprite. Sprite. Where am I going to even put Sprite? That's a great question. I don't know. Sprite, I don't know. I'm going to put Sprite in tier 3, I think. But I'm going to put it below Punk. I think that's a good spot for it. I think even if Sprite did see more play, like Sprite actually still sees like a decent amount of play if you check Master Duel meta. I'm going to talk about Gishkis separately. I'm going to talk about Gishkis mostly in reference to Gishki Sprite, but we'll talk about those separately. But Sprite, it's funny because before I used to space out all the different Sprite variants on the tier list, and now it kind of feels like there's not really, like Tri-Sprite isn't really a thing anymore because of Nimble Beaver being limited. Pure Sprite is like still kind of a thing. Twin Sprite, oh, do I not have Live Twins on here at all? Okay, I'll use the Sprite slot to also talk about Twin Sprite then. I think that overall, all these Sprite variants are lower tier 3, maybe even bordering on Rogue, but I think the only reason they would border on Rogue is because people aren't really just playing the deck. Even myself, I mean, the reason I've moved on from Sprite mostly isn't because I think the deck is bad or I don't like it, but because I have played this so much in recent months, so much that I know it very, very well, and I don't think that continuing to play it is going to cause me to like get any better with it. So I want to branch out and learn other decks and get those into my repertoire. That's why I've been playing a lot of Mathmech recently, is because I really like Mathmech, and didn't even know the new support was like coming out, and then now all of a sudden like it's going to get even better. So of course I always knew it was going to come out somewhere down the line, just didn't know it was coming out this soon. Anyway, yeah, Sprite tier 3, I think that's a good spot for it. Ninja I'm definitely going to put in upper rogue. I'll put it above Evil Eye because Ninja is the Gravity Ninja Geo, good old Geo Biden, flipping monsters face down, making them unable to flip face up, but also just the sheer amount of advantage that Ninja can recur in the long game is pretty insane. So I think that the deck is, I don't think it's necessarily underrated. I think it is about, like, appropriately, you see about as much of it as you'd expect to see in the meta for its power level. But, I don't know. I can't help but wonder if maybe this deck is, like, I feel like this happened to TCG too, didn't it? Where, like, people were constantly wondering, how good is Ninja really? I can definitely see why, because it's very mysterious as far as, like, where it actually fits into the tier list. But I'll put it in upper rogue here, for sure. That's also where I'm going to put Runic, but I'll put Runic above Ninja. For Runic, I'm mostly thinking of, like, for higher Runic, right? Maybe some Runic Sprite. Runic Stun, like, when you see Runic, it's like never Runic Stun anymore. I mostly see it with for higher. I would definitely call this, like, the top of Rogue. Like, Runic variants, Runic for higher. The borderline between Fluanderies and Runic, I would say, is the difference between tier 3 and Rogue, which, as is the case with a lot of these decks, all these different tiers, they tend to get blurred together quite a bit. So, Yumi control has been cropping up a little bit more recently. It topped in the recent MCS, so I thought I'd include it. I'm going to put it here next to Stun, because let's be real, we call it control, but we also all throw air quotes around control. Like, between the Karyushin and they also play There Can Be Only One, those are floodgates. It's pretty much a stun deck, but I will say it is more of a control deck than stun is because of, like, the deep sea stealth attack or whatever, the continuous trap card. Like, there are, in, like, the jellyfish or whatever, there are control elements to it, but a lot of what it core depends on is, like, floodgates. Basically, essentially, floodgates. So we'll call it Yumi again, quote unquote control. We'll put it here in Rogue. Tearlaments. Tearlaments has actually bounced back a lot harder than I think a lot of us expected to realize. I'm gonna put it in tier 3, but you could make an argument that it's lower tier 2. I've been seeing a lot more Tearlaments lately, and you know what? I'm also willing to admit that I was wrong in the direction that I thought Tearlaments should take. I didn't think there was going to be enough good mill targets to justify going full mill in Tearlaments, but people have proven with, like, Jet Synchron and the Pineapple Dragon, what is it, Soldier Palm? Yeah, Soldier Palm, that there's still quite a bit of stuff to mill for Tearlaments, and I do think that people, like, were underplaying the deck when it was in Rogue. Like, especially after, to be fair, I was one of those people who was like, oh, tier is just gutted, it's definitely Rogue. But a lot of us, I think, really underestimated it. I did, for sure. I'm going to put it in upper tier 3. I think it's a very solid deck. Labyrinth. Labyrinth has managed to push its way up to tier 1 status. So, I want to talk about Labyrinth for a second here. This deck, I think, is just more well-poised in the meta. Well, it did actually receive a new tool in the form of the Karma Cannon, right? That definitely was a noticeable boost to its power level, because not only is the Karma Cannon just a very powerful card overall, but it specifically addresses one of the major weaknesses of Labyrinth, which was that it didn't really have a way to deal with Towers monsters outside of, like, Underworld Goddess and the extra deck. You know, when I would play Sprite all these recent months and I'd go against Lab, I think to myself, alright, I just need to make Avermax with IP, and they can't really out that at all. But that's absolutely not true anymore. So, not only did that boost the power level of Lab, but also the meta very much more favors a deck like Labyrinth, right? It's not so fast anymore, like decks like Tearlaments and Sprite were making the meta out to be, where, you know, these slower strategies just can keep up with, like, how many cards, like, a Tearlaments deck could mill and cycle through, or how many bodies a Sprite deck could consistently vomit onto the board, right? But now that we have some less consistent decks taking, some spotlights in the meta, like, Kashtira, or, other decks like Purrely, which are consistent but don't have, like, as explosive of an end board, now a grindy deck like Labyrinth can absolutely come in and, generate enough advantage in enough of amount of time to snowball over these decks before, their huge threats become, game ending, right? So I think it's funny. Labyrinth with his, huge chain links in the draw phase almost in a way feels like what Tearlament did when Tearlament was tier 1, right? In that regard, like playing on your opponent's turn and doing all, like comboing on your turn and then on their turn as well, or vice versa, with the coup clock and all the furniture and stuff. So it definitely took the deck getting big welcome to get to the point where it could really start doing this. But again, I think it wasn't just the card mechanic that pushed it to tier 1, but also just the shifting of the meta due to the ban lists and new card releases overall. So interesting to see Lab take its position in tier 1. I don't think it is the best tier 1 deck. We'll get to that here in a moment. I'm sure you all know what it is, but Lab's still the best it's ever been right now in Master Duel. So Exosister, this is absolutely not the format for Exosister. It's not like Arise Heart is completely dominating everything and making graveyard decks invalid, but like, Lab is like, it's just all these decks right now that can just play fine under, like, Exosister, right? Not triggering their graveyard moving effects. Again, Exosister saw its peak when Tearlament, which very much cared about the graveyard, was at its peak. Exo is still an upper rogue deck, but I'll put it like around the power level of like Evil Eye and Spyral. That feels right for it right now. Mikanko. Mikanko. I'm called. Well. Oof. Okay, it's either the top of Rogue or like the bottom of tier 3. But I think it's actually a little bit better than Flunder. I do think Mikanko is a tier 3 deck. I think the tier 3 pool is actually pretty wide right now, which is another sign of this being a highly varied meta and a lot of decks being viable right now. Yeah, Mikanko, like, it can just steal games so easily. We'll talk about Numeron. I mean, do I even need to talk about Numeron? In fact, I'm going to put it right next to Stun. Actually, I'm going to put Numeron at the bottom of the tier list, because, like, really, with the existence of Mikanko, Numeron is so obsolete. Like, Numeron can go full hard into the just blind second, playing literally all disruption and hand traps, and then your Numeron stuff. But Mikanko does have more nuance to it. Like, Mikanko is kind of known as going second deck, and that is very often how it's played, but it can actually go first, too. You can play it with Dogmaticas, it's got nuanced lines and plays. It's not only the more interesting version, but because it is more varied in what it does, it's more flexible to different situations than a deck like Numeron that does literally one thing and one thing only. It ends up being a lot better as a result. Not only more interesting, but better. So, yeah, I'll put Mikanko in tier 3. I think it's a little bit better than Flaunderies even. Yeah. I think it's about the same power level as Sprite, maybe a little bit worse than Punk. I think that's a good spot for it. Hell, you know what? I might even put it a little bit above Sprite. In the interest of remaining entirely objective, you absolutely see more Mikankos running around now than Sprite. So I'm going to put it there. I think that's a good spot for it. Naturia, I'm going to talk about Naturia Runic separately from like Runic for Hire and other Runic variants. Should I have even though? I don't know. It's pretty much the same spot, honestly. I'll even put it like just pretty much right next to it. I don't think the ability to pump out Nat Beast is like... I mean, being able to negate spells is definitely not bad at all in this meta. In fact, it is very, very good. But I don't think that the deck is pumping out Nat Beast like super duper consistently. I probably could have just lumped this in with the other Runic variants, to be totally honest. I don't have, I think, much unique to say about it. Personally, because I don't play the deck a lot, even though I do have the stuff for it. But, yeah, I don't know. It's a fine deck. Gishki is mostly talking about Gishki Sprite, but you can play Gishkis without the Sprite. I had said that I thought this was going to be the best Gishki variant. I mean, the best Sprite variant, sorry. but I will say that I bought into the hype a little bit, probably because it was a Sprite deck. I think Gishki, I don't know. I really want to put it in tier 3, but mostly because we've just not seen that many people playing it. I'm going to put it in upper rogue, above stuff like Ninja and Evil Eye, but a little bit below the Runic variants too. I will say it's a very, very good deck, like any other rogue deck, but this is one of those decks where maybe if more people were trying it, it would actually gain that tier 3 status. I think the main issue with it is just the fact that Grimness locks you into only being able to attack with rituals. Like, that actually ends up mattering a lot more than I thought, and a lot more than I think we all thought. So yeah, I think Upper Rogue is a fine spot for Gishki Sprite and other Gishki variants. Alright, let's talk about the kitty in the room. That, of course, being Purrely's. And also being, in my opinion, if I can put it up here, there we go, the top tier 1 deck of the format. But, as I was saying earlier, I don't think the difference between tier 1 and other decks in the meta right now is like as high as it's been in the past. And I don't think Purrely stands too much higher than even decks like, Mathmech and Sword Soul, and Desia and Punk and the other tier 3 decks and whatnot. That said, what Purrely mainly has going for it is consistency. The thing that Kashtira crucially lacks, Purrely has in abundance, between all the quick play spells and My Friend and opening the Purrelys themselves. Like, this deck, like, it almost never, like, doesn't have plays. Like, when was the last time you've seen a Purrely deck brick, right? Like, it's just so easy, even if you don't have, like, a turn 1 Noir necessarily, it's still, like, very, very easy to have a board in general. And for that reason, yeah, I do think that Purrely is just the best tier 1 deck of the meta. I do think Purrely should probably get hit. I don't usually take the time to talk about potential hits to decks in these kind of videos, but Purrely, I will say, like, as far as what should get hit, I think Delicious and or Sleepy to 1 is the way to go. I'd like to see Delicious to 1, personally, because, getting the plump out, that seems to be the main way of doing the majority of your plays. Obviously, drawing a ton of cards is also pretty absurd, so that's why I said, Delicious and or Sleepy. I think they'll probably put those cards to 2 first, but I would like to see them to 1. That's just my personal take on a Purrely hit there. But yeah, I do think they end up being the top deck of the meta, which I'm going to put on my I told you so hat again. I said so much when Kashtira came out, like, especially like right after they came out, and I was like deck building with them and testing with Kashtira. I told people that Purrely is still the best deck of the format, way more so than Kashtira. And people were like, really? You think so? I don't know about that. But nope. Again, I get to do my little I told you so dance, and Purrely does in fact end up being the best deck of the meta. So it makes me wish I had made this tier list video sooner, actually, now that I think about it, but whatever. Anyway, Sky Strikers are definitely an upper rogue deck. Thrust coming out hugely boosted this deck, actually. Oh, I didn't even talk about that with, like, Branded Desia. Yeah, Thrust, obviously, a huge boost to that deck's power level. So, same is true of Sky Strikers. Enough to definitely put them in upper rogue. I think even above ninjas, honestly. Like, the deck is still a little bit weak in what it does, but, yeah, I definitely think that the Thrust hugely helped this deck out. Tri-Brigade Lyrilusk, we definitely still see a lot just around in general, be it in, like, hitting Master from time to time or in tournament tops from time to time. I'll put it around the same power level as, like, Dinos and Thunder Dragons and Galaxy-Eyes and Pen Magician. Yep, it's a pretty safe rogue pick there. Rika Sun Avalon is absolutely a tier 3 deck. I'm gonna put it between Tearlaments and Punk, I think. Because I think the thing that holds Rika Sun Avalon back most is Maxi, honestly. It just does not play very well into that card. And I think Mathmech also kind of has that issue, just not nearly to the same degree that like Rikas and Avalon does. I don't know. It's interesting that obviously Maxi impacts the meta as a whole, but there are certain archetypes that just have such a tough time playing through it or against it without countering it that they are actually impacted. Like, if Maxi weren't around, I think this would be more like the TCG, where we see Rikas and Avalon have a little bit more success, but not a bad deck by any means at all. Very solid tier 3 deck, I think is the right spot for it. Traptrix, I would call this an upper rogue deck for sure. I'd put it about the same power level as like Sky Striker and Ninja. I'll put it between the two, actually. I think that's a good spot for it. It is definitely overshadowed as a control trap deck that doesn't use Floodgates by Labyrinth, because Labyrinth can, recycle resources more consistently and just overall has like slightly higher power level cards, but don't underestimate Traptrix by any means. Still a very, 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 very good deck. Dragon Link. Dragon Link I will call the top of tier 2, I think. Yes, I will definitely call Dragon Link the top of tier 2. It's definitely better than Mathmech, but not quite tier 1. I think mostly because it ends up being a longer form combo deck. It ends up being more susceptible to disruption, as I've talked about with other decks here on this tier list. But the thing is, it is so powerful in what it does and has so many ways to recoup, recover, and just do alternate combo lines that it still ends up being a very, very highly tiered deck as a result. You can make an argument that maybe this is actually the lower tier 1, but I don't think it's necessarily in a better spot than Kashtira is. I don't know. It's interesting, but I'll put it here at the top of tier 2. I think it's a safe place for it. Salamangreats. So Salamangreats, it's interesting. They actually did get a recent boost in the form of the Flame Princess, and I don't think that Link 3 by itself is going to be enough to like boost, like rocket up Salamangreat out of Rogue and into like tier 3 or even 2, but it's hard to say because the card also just recently came out in the OCG, so it's hard to know exactly how much that card is going to help fire decks. I will say it very, very much helps fire decks that want to link climb, and Salamangreat is like prime example of that, so does seem very good in that deck. We'll see how much impact that ends up having. I will put it here with like Dinos and Tri-Brigade Lyrilusk. You know what? No, I think that's fine. Yeah, we'll put it just like right around there. That's okay. Heroes are going to be up a little bit higher, more in the realm of Ninjas and Evil Eye. One recently topped in the MCS. Hero, I don't know. Hero, like, briefly enjoyed in existence in tier 3 when Tearlaments were tier 0 because Dark Law is just so good against that deck. But I think overall, the deck has mostly remained at the same power level for the entirety of Master Duel's lifespan. It has actually gotten more support as time has gone on. It's just that support hasn't been enough to, like, push it out of the Rogue category, which is fine. It's still a fine deck. Midolche, I'll put it, like, yeah, put it right around here. Eternal Rogue deck, very, very good. But, yeah, just hasn't gotten support in God knows when. Oh my goodness, Scareclaw. So Scareclaw, I was surprised. In terms of, like, how many Scareclaw decks are submitted to Master Duel meta, it was actually above stuff like Branded Despia and Sword Soul and some of these decks in tier 2 even. I'm going to put Scareclaw in tier 3. I kind of want to put it above Tearlaments. And I think I will, actually. This deck got hugely boosted in the latest pack, not only by, you know, a couple of its own cards that came out, like Defanging and Twin Saw, but on top of that, the second wave of Kashtira support actually really, really helps this deck. Oh, and also, of course, Scareclaw Kashtira, very, very good extender. But, you know, this deck has the ability to still make the tryhard is so good. Like the fact that it can lock stuff down on turn 1 and it can OTK on turn 2. I think overall, it wasn't even necessarily a consistency boost. It was just a small power level boost that was enough for Scareclaw to actually see a lot of meta relevance right now. I don't think a lot of people, myself included, saw this coming, but, you know, a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. Rescue Ace, got just 2 more decks to talk about. Rescue Ace being one of those. Rescue Ace I do think is a rogue deck right now until it gets its next wave of support, and then it becomes a tiered deck. But for the time being, I think it is kind of slept on a little bit. Like, I think it's... I'll put it above, like, Ninja. Maybe not. I'll put it below Ninja. That feels like a good spot for it. Like, the deck has some pretty solid plays right now. But again, once it gets its next wave of support, it's like, it's definitely busting into some of these upper tiers here. And finally, Valance. Valance doing not just Pendulum things, even though they are a Pendulum deck, but very much their own things. Spinning out that Fossil Dyna Secret Village. Yeah, I think they are better than Panda Magicians, but I'll put them more around here, around like Exosister and Spyral. So, alright, there we have it. There is our tier list. Ooh, these tier list videos are always so much longer than I intend them to be. I'm looking at this, and yeah, I like this. I think this is where I like having each respective deck in the meta right now. Yeah, definitely, again, let me know what you think in the comments, and please feel free to disagree. Again, I just ask that you don't be rude about it. That's not fun. But discourse is fun, rudeness is not. So that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. And with that, let's just go ahead and move now to our outro. Alright everybody, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching it all the way to the very end. That means a whole lot to me, and it's also a fantastic way to support the channel. And if you're interested in supporting the channel in other ways besides YouTube, there are plenty of ways to do that. If you check out the description below, you'll find a bunch of links down there. One of them goes to my Patreon. You're actually seeing the names of everyone subscribed to the Patreon on the screen right now. So if you're interested in getting your name in the credits here at the end, if you want to see more daily Master Duel content, or if you're interested in one-on-one private coaching sessions, I offer all of that on Patreon. I also stream live on Twitch. Feel free to go ahead and click that link and follow and or subscribe there. I also have the Discord community, if you want to follow that link, where hundreds of duelists have already signed up. Free to join, and you can just come hang out, talk about the game, and chill in general. Final link that's going to be in the description is my Twitter. You can follow that if you want some more notifications of what's happening with the channel. So, all in all, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.